Who's that guy in that old shirt? Who must be the fence expert? Who's that guy in that old shirt? Who must be the fence expert? It's almost time to talk about the fences. It's time to discuss operations and expenses. It's time, it's really time to elevate small businesses. It's time for Joe to drop his knowledge, it's relentless. This rhyme of mine is getting a bit ridiculous. Here we go, we're live with Joe. Enjoy the show.
All right, Andrew, for like the 4 or 5 people that maybe, I don't know, live under a rock, haven't watched the show, maybe a brief introduction of yourself and kind of what it is you do.
Yeah, so I'm the founder and president of Atlas Financial Strategies. We're a fee-based financial planning firm. And so when people think financial planning, they usually think investments, and investments are a part of a financial plan. But what we do covers business planning, estate planning, tax planning, investments as well, if necessary. But I mean, it's kind of all, estate planning, all those things. It's all encompassing to where a good financial plan covers everything you have going on, not just, numbers and documents and things like that. But basically, it's how can we make sure that whatever it is that you want out of life, right? Whatever your dream life is, takes money touches every part of your life. So it's our job to make sure that your financial situation can hopefully, we manage that in such a way that you can accomplish what you want most out of life, whatever that might be for you.
Sure, sure. One thing we were talking about before we started pressing record is I think the conversation today sounds like estate planning, right? And maybe the term estate planning is encompassing, but it might be misleading to some contractors that are watching that say, what estate, right? Like I don't have an estate, or I don't have, but they do have a house, a few trucks, maybe 401k, maybe something like that. Those would be deemed like in an estate plan. There would be a plan for those in an estate plan. Is that right?
Yeah. So estate plan might be a little bit misleading because when people hear the term estate, they think, very wealthy, they picture the sprawling estate,
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily always the case, right? So everybody has an estate. Now, I guess estate planning is better than the term death planning, but I mean that's basically what that is, right? So yeah, I mean I've been doing this for a while, and I could count on one hand, if I was missing some fingers, how many people we've met with that when they came to us had their estate planning done and up to date. Like it almost never happens. Everybody knows it's important. Everybody knows they need to get it done. They've been meaning to get it done, but for whatever reason, they haven't gotten it done. So with our, kind of friendly nudging, we'll make sure that they get that done. And there's the formal part of your estate plan. So like will, living will, powers of attorney, things like that, maybe a trust, which we'll discuss all those things. But there's also parts of an estate plan that I think are missing from what you might get from an attorney that's part of a formal estate plan, which we'll get into those things as well.
Okay. And I think, and here's why I think this is important, because there might be a few different camps of thought here, right? One is, well, I'm still building my success. I'm not there yet. When I become successful, whenever that might be, that's when I should do this, right? Or just that thought. Or maybe I don't have enough to have an estate plan is one thing we'd already said. I think it's important probably to note here that estate planning isn't like a one-time event either. It probably should be something that you build with as you build success alongside of your success.
Absolutely. Yeah. So every adult person needs at least basic estate planning, which again includes a will, living will, powers of attorney, both healthcare and financial. And I can explain what those things mean. And then again, maybe a trust. But yeah, it's not a set it and forget it thing, right? So, I mean, generally speaking, let's assume you got your estate planning done this year. Generally speaking, the triggering events that might cause your estate plan to need to be updated are things like, if you were to get married, get a divorce, have children, move to a different state, open up new businesses, because those will need to be included in the estate plan, buy new properties, those will likely need to be, updated in the estate plan. Or just generally every 5 years or so, just because laws change. It's not a bad idea to take the documents back to an attorney or somebody and make sure that they review them and make sure that they are still in line with whatever the current laws are.
Sure. That makes sense. And it's important too that you start now, right? In terms of maybe you just have a house and a truck. Maybe you just have a truck. Maybe we're still working on getting the house. Maybe we're still working on, but having a plan for what you do have now, because everyone, no one plans for an early demise, right? No one says, I've probably got about 5 good years left and I need to figure this out right now. Everyone thinks, well, I've got 30, 40 years of runway to go. Like I'll figure this out. And hopefully that's the case. Yeah. Hopefully that's the case, but starting the plan now could save quite a bit of heartache maybe in the near future should something happen.
Yeah, we, especially us guys, we all have the S on our chest, right? We all think we're Superman and we're invincible and we're going to live forever and all those things. So, we all know people that have passed way before they should have.
No.
And especially if you have children, minor children or adult children, super important. And what ends up happening, and, like we talked about before we started recording, like we've done multiple over the last 6-12 months, we've done multiple estate planning workshops and things like that. And they're just in conversations with people, like there are so many little parts of an estate plan that should be, if you to be done well, or what I would, consider to be done well, we got to have all the T's crossed or I's dotted, because we're going to end up, everybody, if you have children, most people want to leave their children in a better spot financially and just kind of in life, emotionally and all the things. We just want our children to be, have a better life than we had, and be better people than we turned out to be, and all the stuff, right? We just want our children to be better. Well, what sometimes ends up happening without proper planning is that you end up dumping a problem or multiple problems in their lap, and you make things harder, or you might be the seed that, especially with adult children, like you might be the, one of the causes that, causes their relationship to be less strong, right? Mm-hmm. And nobody wants that if you have children. So, there are just so many things. Everybody knows somebody, presumably, that, mom or dad passed away, and, they just didn't have things as prepared as they wanted to. So they might have gone through probate, which is expensive and arduous, and just otherwise a pain in the butt that is, for the most part, easily avoidable with some, pretty easy planning. And then everybody knows a family or something where siblings are arguing, or you have mixed families, multiple, this is a second marriage and they have children from other marriages. And like, there's just, these complexities that end up throwing a real wrinkle in things that, again, with some good forethought, with some good proper planning, could be easily avoided. And this is not meant to, what do the kids say today, throw shade at my attorney friends.
Sure.
But, what I find, or I guess in my opinion, is that, the attorney is there to write up the documentation, right? So they're there at least a little bit. Most attorneys are there on like the more transactional side to like, hey, you need this estate planning done. I'll write up these documents for you and we'll get them done. Yeah. In my opinion, I think that there's a lot missing from like the pre-planning and the discovery, if you will, and just kind of the conversation to kind of really get to the root of what we're trying to do. And then the follow-up and the follow-through of the estate planning, right? Because sometimes, again, just making sure that we have beneficiaries listed the way that we need to make sure that we have, some organization in there where, people know that you have these things and where to find them. And then if you do have a trust is really only good if things are titled to the trust and or we have made the trust beneficiary on things. So I could share a lot of stories with you, but I mean, we've ran into client has a trust set up. Nothing is titled to the trust. The trust isn't made beneficiary on anything. And we've looked through all the estate planning documentation and there's no pour over. There's no, none of that's going to happen. And it's like, well, you paid to have a trust done.
Yeah.
And because there was the follow up or follow through, like you might as well not have it. Right. So just a lot of missing pieces, I think.
And what that sounds like, Andrew, it sounds like, there's different specialties here. We're talking about lawyers. We're talking about financial planners. A lot of times we're talking about accountants too, to at least give some sort of insight on that. We're talking about maybe insurance agents, if life insurance is coming into play, that sort of thing. You need to have a quarterback, right? To where, in the case you're talking about, I don't know it, but it could be that one hand didn't know what the other was doing. So maybe this person said, hey, I need a trust so I can put these things in it. So a lawyer presumably created the trust, said, here you go. Now, and maybe the lawyer didn't even say, now you need to hand this off to someone else so they can start tying it all together. This person probably knew he needed to check off some boxes, but didn't know how to make them interface, right? He really probably needed a quarterback to tie everything together, it sounds like.
Man, you literally took the words right out of my mouth. Those are basically the exact same language I use. Like, somebody's got to quarterback the plan. Yeah. So generally with a lot of business owners, especially as you get, more successful and you realize, like, hey, I kind of build a team of professionals that I can rely on, a CPA, a planner, an attorney, a insurance broker, or whoever. Somebody, to your point, somebody has to act as quarterback of that plan. And generally nobody on the team is kind of willing to, carry the torch, so to speak, for that. And so that duty falls upon the client, the business owner, generally. And it's just not maybe their strength or what they're best suited to do, right? So it would be like me being the captain of a cricket team. I don't know anything about cricket, but you know what I mean? So
right.
I would not be best suited to lead that team. So we generally will kind of carry that torch and be that coach, quarterback, what have you, and make sure that because what ends up happening, these people are working in silos, right? And the CPA, the attorney, the whoever, they're kind of working, they're living in their bubble, they're taking care of whatever they're taking care of, and there's not any communication, collaboration, right? You have the pieces of the puzzle, but they may not be fitting together in a way that creates the picture that we want it to create, right? So that happens all the time. And I'll share a brief story with you. We just we're still in the process, but we just kind of wrapped up the initial phase of the plan for a client here locally. Contractor client, very successful guy, has had a multi-decade career. Getting close to, in the next couple of years, selling the business and all that. And so he knows that that's a big part of what we do. And so he came to us for the personal planning side, the estate planning side, and then to kind of start the process of, how to make sure what do we do once we sell the business in a couple of years. So, we went through and when he first came in here for the consultation, he was like, I already have a trust done. We have all this estate planning done, and just very kind of confidently, like, we have all that taken care of. And I was like, well, just as part of the process, we're going to want copies. We're going to review it. We're going to talk with your attorney. We're just crossing T's and dotting I's. We just want to make sure that we're second set of eyes on things. And he's like, sure, but just kind of basically like, if that's your process, that's fine, but it's all hand.
Sure. Yep.
And so, his, the plan is basically his succession plan for the business. If he were to die before it's sold, is all of his children are adults and all doing well. And he's like, well, upon my passing, my son would step in and manage the business and get it sold. And for his, service in that matter, he'll get 10% gross proceeds from the sale. The trust will get the rest of it, and which will go to my wife and so on. And they have a dozen paid off properties that they're, rental properties that the trust owns that they're getting income from, and all these things. So as we start reviewing the trust and other documentation, we find a couple problems. One, it says, first of all, the trust doesn't own the business right now. So these things that the trust, it's not going to happen the way that you think it's going to happen. Also, it says that your son will get 10% net of the proceeds, right? So in other words, the trust will pay the taxes on the sale. Trusts pretty much always are taxed by default at the highest possible rate, right? So, which is not ideal. And so we're talking about like an 8-figure exit of this business at some point, right? So, we're talking about multi-million. And so you said you wanted your son to get 10% gross. In the trust, it says your son's going to get 10% net. Also, he goes by his nickname, and in the trust, it has his nickname instead of his legal name. That's an issue. The business's name is a little bit different in the trust than it is on his tax returns, than it is on the articles of incorporation. So it's the trust, or the name of his business is a little bit different everywhere. And so, there was kind of several issues that we were like, hey, we're going to have a conversation with the attorney and get all these squared away. So we had a conversation with the attorney, and we were like, hey, first of all, obviously his name needs to be, his legal name, not his nickname in here. The business's name is a little bit, and this is a perfect example of the silos, right?
Yeah.
Because the attorney isn't necessarily looking at tax returns and things like that. So again, business's name is a little bit different in all these places. So we had a conversation with the attorney, with the CPA, all these things, like business's name needs to be the same across the board.
Yeah.
So we need to figure out how to rectify that. And I was like, I think the cleanest way, first of all, we need to get the business in the trust. And then, maybe the cleanest way for your son to get his 10% gross of the proceeds, instead of it, being as part of the trust, we can have your son have 10% synthetic equity or phantom stock. So we can just, do that, which basically means he doesn't own the business, but he gets 10% of the proceeds of the sale, and then he's going to be responsible for the taxes and all those things. And so we, created this plan, and I won't go into, a tremendous amount of detail, but we created this plan, got all these things squared away. And, we figured out a way that based on his plans, we'll save him, probably $2.5–3 million in taxes upon the sale of the business, which he thought was amazing and music to his ears. But it's just, I think just a second set of eyes, man. And I think I could not tell you how many people we've seen that are like, I have all that taken care of and everything is squared away and all that stuff. When we start digging in, and it's like, well, that's not necessarily the case based on what you said you think it says or what you want it to say. It doesn't say those things, and or it's not going to happen the way that you said you want it to happen. So if that's truly the way you want it to happen, here's the fixes, and we can get that done. And if so, let's get to work.
Nice. Well, and something to think about here too. So, there's a chance maybe that went off without a lot of hitches, right? If it wasn't contested, and if it wasn't, maybe. But it's one of those things, right. It seems like one of those things that you have to plan for the worst, right? That maybe it is contested, and maybe that, and so then everything needs to be as dialed in as possible. All the T's crossed and I's dotted, because if not, then it's giving someone else a little bit more fuel for the fire to maybe contest something. Another thing to think about, though, it seems like, is all this is going on after a passing, right? In which not everyone is in the best frame of mind, mentally, emotionally, that sort of thing, to be handling things like this, and so to your point earlier, you could be giving more stressors to this situation. You could be sowing more seeds of just maybe regret, or maybe just not positivity, seeds of negativity. When ultimately, to your initial point, was like, we're trying to create a plan that provides for everybody, right? We're trying to say, hey, I want my kids to have better than I had. And so in my version of that is this, and this. Well, but there's so many unintended consequences if you don't get it quite right. And you don't want to leave that legacy, right? That, Dad meant well, but man, did he create some chaos for a while.
Yeah, he screwed the pooch on that one, right? Like, that's not, especially as a man who we want to be kind of the beacon of, we have these things figured out and we're providing and protecting, our family.
Yeah.
And one of the last memories being, wow, we created a nightmare for everybody, is, I would imagine, the last thing that, we would want. And a great example of that, and we can get into the difference between equal and fair. So I think a lot of people think that they're going to split, let's say they have 2 children, and they're like, we're just going to split everything 50-50, and because it is equal, it is fair. And that's not always necessarily the case. But like, we're working with some business owners or two brothers, mom and dad started the business a long time ago, and it's grown, and the mom and dad still own a chunk of the business, but they're kind of, they're basically retired, and the brothers are running it and own, a minority stake, 24% each. And as part of the parents own commercial properties, they own a big farm, they have investments in life insurance and things like that. And then obviously their shares of the business. So they're basically just going to split everything 50-50. And, that means the commercial real estate 50-50. That means the farm 50-50. That means everything 50-50. So the one son, the farm is his happy place. That's where he wants to live. He wants to farm post sale of the business and, all these things. The other brother doesn't care about the farm at all. He doesn't want anything to do with the farm. And so we kind of had this kind of family therapy session, if you will, right, with the parents and the brothers and everybody. And so we, kind of hashed these things out. And I said, hey, look, this son really wants to farm, huge emotional attachment to the farm. That's where he wants to live. That's what he wants to do. Other brother doesn't want anything to do with it. So like what's going to happen is if they inherit it 50-50, the first son is going to own 50% of this farm, and he's going to be doing 100% of the work for 50% of the profit. Not fair to him. Also, the other son is going to, since he owns half the farm, he's also, not fair to him, going to own 50% of the liabilities of the farm. So if things go wrong, if the first son isn't a good business person, or it goes under for some reason, or they get sued, or any number of things that go wrong with it, the other son is going to be dragged into this unbeknownst to him, because he doesn't want to have anything to do with that. So, brother, the other son could buy him out potentially, but then they have to, it's going to be a whole thing. So I'm like, hey, look, the easy way to do this maybe is like, let's make sure that the son that wants the farm gets the farm outright. And let's make sure that the other son gets more of something else to make it, as close to equal as possible, but much more fair, much more simple, less headaches for them, less all the stuff. Right. So again, easy fix. I feel like the problem with a lot of, relationships comes from lack of communication, right? So if we can just communicate clearly about things, that will solve a lot of the problems. So, some of the times it's that gets into like the letter of intent. So again, if you don't mind, I'll kind of briefly discuss some of the parts that like the non-formal part of an estate plan that I think needs to be part of an estate plan. So one we call a master file. And that is basically everything in one place that somebody were to need if you were to pass away. So like copies of estate planning documents, information on bank accounts, life insurance policies, investment accounts, properties, passwords if needed, all the stuff, whatever anybody were to need in one place if you were to pass away. And then I think there needs to be 2 copies of that. Obviously, you would keep a copy. And then whoever is the executor of your estate, which would be in your estate planning documents, since they're going to be the ones dealing with these things upon your passing, they would have the backup copy. And then, as you can imagine, that's a living, breathing document. That document is only good if it is up to date, right? So it's, very good to have estate planning documents, very good to have life insurance and bank accounts, investment accounts, and all those things that you plan to go to whoever. But they don't do any good if people don't know that they exist or where to find them, right? So like our COO, Megan, her mom passed away a handful of years ago, and her mom's friend was like, I think your mom had a will, but I'm not really sure, and I wouldn't know where it is. So like a lot of people end up doing, Megan ended up rummaging through her mom's house, looking at every sheet of paper, trying to figure out what she had and where it is, never found a will. So Megan ends up calling 40 attorneys in and around the area and was like, here's the situation, here's my mom's name, do y'all have a file with her name on it? The answer was no with all 40. She stopped at 40. So to this day does not know if her mom had a will or not. So if she did have a will, what good did it do? Right. So that's a master file. So anybody listening, we have a template for that. If you would like a template to at least kind of just get the juices flowing and get the process started, reach out to the office. We're happy to send it to you. and we'll email it to you. Anyways, it's super easy to follow. And if you need that template, you can create your own. But if you would like something to kind of get started, we're happy to send it to you. So reach out. The other part of that is a letter of intent, right? So this is a non-legally binding, basically our wishes or just kind of communication. So your letter of intent, in my opinion, could be one of two things. It could be instructions, or it could be what we call a financial love letter. So as instructions, so like I have a letter of intent for my wife. My children are young. And so for my wife, I know she used to be a chemical engineer, but as you can imagine, I'm the money spouse and I'm the one that handles the stuff. And she would prefer to stay a little bit blissfully ignorant to how, how all
Sure.
these things are managed. So I created a letter of intent because if she gets life insurance money and investments and all the other stuff, knowing her the way I do, she'd probably stick it in the bank. And that's not the best use of that money, right? And wouldn't know who to call or whatever. So my letter of intent, at least part of it, is like, hey, part A, I'd like to see you take this amount of money and do these things with it as detailed as I can possibly get. Here's the professional that I would like to see you reach out to help you with part A because they're a trusted friend. Part B, same deals. Part C, same deal, right? Now, she doesn't have to do any of those things, but it brings me a lot of comfort to know I've left the money and the plan. You're going to have to try to screw it up from here.
Sure.
The next part of that is the financial love letter. So this is especially important in lots of cases, but particularly if you have adult children, right? So it could be a little bit like, hey, here's why I left this person this and this person this, because there might be like, well, why did he leave her this and me this? That's unfair. Well, maybe there's a perfectly good explainable reason for that. It's also, especially when a parent or a loved one passes away, it's a very emotional time. And so, people I've heard things like they feel guilty from profiting from mom or dad's death, which of course, is not the way that the parents view it, I'm sure.
Sure.
And there's a little bit of like analysis paralysis of like you kind of mentioned earlier, like, I'm not sure what mom or dad would have wanted me to do with this money, right?
Yeah.
So when maybe the intent, and just using this as an example, maybe the intent with the money or whatever you leave them is, hey, I would love to see you spend this money on experiences and cool vacations with your family, like spend extra time and build memories with your family. That's what I would love to see you do with this money. When maybe they would otherwise never consider or feel super guilty about spending it on awesome vacations because that might seem frivolous or whatever, when maybe that was the exact intent or what you would have, loved to see them spend that money on. So that's what the letter of intent, in my view, kind of those are the two main purposes. And a letter of intent is not always needed, but it's needed way more often than it's utilized.
Well, and it comes in handy. Before we press record, I was telling a story of someone I knew that had recently gone through something like that, which actually there was no plan. And so it was really, there's a house, a vehicle, and it's like, well, what do we do with the house? So and there was multiple siblings. Well, do we sell it? Well, one of the siblings wanted the house. Okay, well, so do you buy it? So now do we get an appraisal, or do we all come to a number? And then what? There's a lot of like, I don't know. And then one sibling says, well, I think dad would have wanted to do this. And then another sibling says, well, he would have never done that. He would have done this. And those two siblings very well could have been right based on their experience with their father, right? But had there been a letter saying, all right, guys, this is an awful time. I'm going to help try to guide you through it how I think I would do it. This, and this, get a public appraisal. If somebody wants it, then here's maybe guide them. And then also, to your point, it takes some of the guilt out of it too, of, maybe one sibling does get their way, but they feel like maybe the other siblings were just giving in to them. So like, I don't know, rather than have a letter that says, hey, we're going to follow the letter. Can we just agree that dad had a pretty good plan here and that we should follow this as closely as possible? Because then it also takes some of the emotion out of it too, it sounds like.
And it's a surprise to a lot of people, depending on the state. So even if you have it even if you do have your estate planning done and you have a will or something like that, and you have it in the will that your home will go to whoever you'd like it to go to, presumably your children. Even if it says that in your will, depending on the state. So like here in Florida, um, even if you have it in your will that you want your child or children to get your home upon your passing, it will still go through Florida probate first.
Hmm.
And so it will likely end up going to them, but it's going to have to go through probate first unless you take one of two steps. You can either put the property in a trust, and that will bypass probate and it'll go to whoever you want it to go to. Now, that may or may not be necessary because with a trust, it's a little bit complex. So it's an added expense, all those things, right? And I'll talk about how I think a trust or when I think a trust for your home would be needed. But the easy, less expensive way to do that is what's called a ladybird deed. So that's basically a beneficiary designation for your home if you want to consider, look at it that way. So that way it'll bypass probate, go directly to who you want it to go to. And that's the cheapest, easiest way to do that. Now, when a trust might be needed is in a case like you described, where there's multiple children and all these things. And so like if you have, cash investments, life insurance, all that sort of stuff is easily split, however you want it split, right? It's hard to split a house, right? So somebody has to make a decision on what to do with this thing. And like you just described, one child might want to sell it. One might want to rent it out and not sell it, use it as an investment. One might want to live in it. There's just all these things, right?
Yeah.
One might want to buy it from the other spouses or other siblings or whatever. So to avoid all that, you could have it go to a trust, which would bypass probate. And then the language in the trust could say, upon my passing, I want the home sold for fair market value and the proceeds split this way between these people. No argument, right?
Mm-hmm.
Easy peasy, one and done. Take the money and go, right? I'm not going to have y'all arguing and hurt your relationships because I didn't have enough intention and foresight to, forethought to, do these things.
Sure.
And kind of to that point, I think it's a surprise to a lot of people that beneficiary designations on things like investment accounts, life insurance, and even bank accounts, which the banks call it a POD or paid on death, which is basically a beneficiary designation for your bank account. But all those things, your beneficiary designations will override whatever it says in your estate planning documents. So as an example, let's say that in my estate planning documents, it says that everything goes to my wife, right? But let's say on my life insurance policies, I have my sister listed as beneficiary. Well, upon my passing, my sister will get the proceeds from the life insurance. It doesn't matter what my estate planning documents say, right? Because that's who the listed beneficiary is, and that will override whatever that says. So I couldn't tell you how many times, more often than should ever happen, where we're sitting with a widow and the deceased husband had his ex-wife still listed as beneficiary on life insurance or 401k or whatever. And she wants to know if there's anything that can be done. And unfortunately not.
Yep.
Right. So you want to talk about an awkward conversation, so I just want to encourage everybody. I did not tell you how many times people have the wrong person listed as beneficiary, wrong meaning, not the person they would intend, the wrong person listed as beneficiary, or they don't have a beneficiary listed at all. And you have to proactively go to the bank, or maybe your bank allows you to do it online, but you have to go in and proactively name a POD or paid on death, they call it, which is, again, just basically a beneficiary designation. But I couldn't tell you how many times, people have had to go through probate for a couple $1,000s in mom's checking account or something, right? And like, what a easily avoidable thing. So everybody listening, here's your sign to number one, call a good local estate planning attorney. Get your basic estate planning done. We'll talk about trusts here in just a moment if you'd like. Make sure beneficiary designations say who you want it to say, and list a backup, a secondary or contingent beneficiary, right? Just in case because presumably if you're married, your spouse is going to be your primary beneficiary on everything. But it's good to list a secondary beneficiary on things just in case y'all were to pass together or very close, and a short time from each other or what have you. wouldn't be a bad idea. A lot of people think, I'm going to list my minor children as beneficiaries on this side or the other, which is generally possible, but you have to name a custodian. So you have to name an adult as a custodian if you want to list your child as a beneficiary. Or if you do have a trust, you would name the trust the secondary beneficiary. Thereupon both of you are passing, it goes to the trust, and it'll end up going to your children, presumably at some point down the road. But beneficiary designations, extraordinarily important and often overlooked.
Can we press pause for just 1 minute and talk about probate, which, and it could vary by state. But essentially my understanding is it's the court system dealing with your whatever assets are left over. And then, so really what you're doing by not having a plan is really putting trust in the court system that they are going to accurately understand the situation and make some sort of judgment that is in the best interest of someone, right? They're not necessarily beholden to your best wishes or what, because the court system doesn't know you. Is that generally the correct understanding of kind of like, in a broad view, how the probate system works?
Conceptually speaking, yes, sir. Yeah. So it will, if there's no good planning and legal documentation stating how we want these things to happen or who gets these assets or this, that, or the other, then it'll be up to a judge in the the court system to decide who gets what and how it's split and all those things, which, to your point, may or may not be. Like, let's say, God forbid, one of your children are, great, upstanding, responsible, wise person. And let's say you have a child that, is not that, right? Whether they have substance abuse issues or whatever. Sure. Well, the court generally, isn't going to care about those things. They're just going to say, hey, it doesn't, these are your two closest living relatives, and these things are going to be split 50-50 this way. And maybe that right there just signed your child with substance abuse. Maybe it just signed their death warrant, because guess how they're going to spend that money?
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
yeah,
it's not going to be on getting help, probably, right? So
yeah. Right.
They're going to make their drug dealer's day. So that's not what anybody wants. So yeah, I mean, and probate can drag on for sometimes years. I mean, in the best instances, it's usually at least several months, but sometimes it can take years and all these things. And then somebody's got to be in charge of it and kind of deal with everything. And it's going to be a part-time job, at least for that person. And it's going to be a huge headache. And then people start fighting and people start arguing. And there's been a lot of relationships ruined between family members because of the probate process, which again, I would assume if the person knew that this would play out the way it did, that they would do anything to make sure that did not happen.
Yeah. To keep it out of that process. No matter who you are, you've heard some story about probate, right? And I don't know that I've ever heard a story where it went super well, where everyone was happy with the process and it worked out just the right way. Like it's never the way it works out, because that's not the court's mission, right? The court's mission is to take the stuff, disperse the stuff. That's what it is. That's what it's for. Not, to your point, all right, let's dig into the siblings. Now, who would use the money in the right way, or what were the wishes? No. The course has no care about that. And also, unfortunately, with multiple siblings, it could end up to be the sibling that has maybe the most financial resources to hire the lawyer to follow the thing all the way through, might be able to sway that process too.
Yeah, and I hate to be cynical about it, but go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say maybe not never. It's hardly ever a good process.
Well, and I've never really thought of it that way, but now that you say that, yeah, I deal with that. I don't want to say a lot, but more often than anybody should. And yeah, there's never really any positive emotions attached to the probate process.
No.
But I hate to be cynical about it, but it's not in any of the attorneys involved with it. It's not in their best interest to make it go smoothly or quickly or any of that. Again, I hate to be cynical, but I mean, they're generally charging by the hour, and the court gets paid every time you go to court. And like, it's not really in the legal system's interest to make sure that this goes smoothly or quickly or any of that. It's quite honestly in their interest to kind of drag it out and spend as much time on it as they can and kind of rack up those billable hours. So, and again, I'm not painting with a broad brushstroke, right? There's some really great attorneys who always have the client's interest at heart. But I mean, if you're looking at it from just a human motivation standpoint, if you're charging by the hour, it's in your best interest to have as many hours involved with it as you can.
Yeah, it could be. And this really kind of falls into the, hope for the best, plan for the worst. I hope it goes super smooth. I hope everyone gets along and it is a breeze of a process. But just in case it isn't, let's have a plan for what if, throw this monkey wrench in. What if this and that and the other? I wanted to press pause for a second and talk about probate because I feel like a lot of people talk about it without getting, and it can vary, your experience may vary with the system and the process, but I think it's good to understand in general terms, that's not something you want to put people through because to our earlier point, you're trying to set these people up for success. Like that's why we do it. Like hardly anyone throws themselves into this because they just love the grind or there's usually a higher motivation. Want to provide for my family, want to provide a better future, want to do better to something. And the probate process doesn't really fit any of those wants or desires. But that was the point I wanted to drive home, I guess.
No, and you're 100% right. And I'm glad you did that because I'm talking about probate, assuming that everybody knows what that is when, a lot of people don't. But to your point, especially for business owners, and again, just as few times as I've had people come to me with their estate planning done, I don't know if I've ever had a business owner come to me with what I would consider a good, thorough, well thought out, legally binding succession plan for what happens to the business if something were to happen to them. And if you're a business owner, presumably a big chunk or the majority of your wealth is in your business. That you've poured a lot of blood, sweat, tears, you've made a lot of sacrifices, you've done a lot of things to grow this business to where it is today. And I'm assuming that you would like your family to be able to capture this value that you've created upon your passing. And the problem with that is that a lot of business owners, I hear a lot of people say, oh, if I die, the business will still run and my family will continue to be able to draw an income from it. I'm like, all right, do me a favor. Take the next 6 months off. And when I say off, I mean off. No phone, email, text, none of that. Like you are dead to the business for the next 6 months. Does that idea make you sweaty? Because if it does, then that means that maybe the business, you know what I mean? Most businesses are way too overly reliant upon the business owner. And it may be able to survive, but it probably won't thrive in your absence. Now, there's certainly exceptions to that rule, right? There's some people that, that they're definitely the exception. Or they'll say, well, my wife or whatever should be able to sell the business upon my passing. And it's like, all right, well, again, back to the problem of most business owners, the business is way too overly reliant upon them and they don't have a lot of good systems and processes in place. They might not have the team in place that they want. So again, without them, the business is not going to thrive. It might survive, but it won't thrive. And so I could not tell you how many times that, give you a good example. I have a client who a couple years ago bought a business that was, in his same industry that he's in. So he bought another business and folded it in. And so as we were talking about it, and so this was, I think, just not long before he started working with us. And as we were talking about it, he was like, man, I got a hell of a deal on it. Sorry for the language. He's like, I got a hell of a deal on it. And he was like, yeah, you know, what happened is I approached this guy before about it when it wasn't interested in selling. And then he passed away. And he's like, I got it for like a third of what it was worth because, you know, without him there, it just was not worth nearly as much. And it was, I mean, basically even that third was probably better than the wife would have got, you know, elsewhere. So, yeah, I just could not tell you how often that happens. So,
Yeah.
You know, the business value, anyways, we got to have a good plan for the business, some sort of contingency plan. We're all going to exit our business at some point, at some, you know, some way. We all hope it's going to go the way that we want it to go. And I hope it does too, but we need to have a plan for what happens if it doesn't go the way that we want it to go.
Sure. Absolutely. So, and it sounds like we're kind of getting back to where we were before I pressed pause, which is it felt like we were moving more towards trust and just kind of how those might work to avoid probate, or maybe not avoid, but just keep things from going to probate. And can we maybe start at just a 30,000 foot view of what a trust? I mean, they can take many shapes and sizes, I'm sure, but can we maybe, like I said, take a 30,000 foot view of maybe what a trust is and how it acts?
Absolutely. And it probably wouldn't be a bad idea, just like we defined probate, to define a trust and what it is, like you mentioned, but also define what a will is, what a living will is, what powers of attorney is, healthcare financial. Like, I'll just kind of, at least from a basic financial planning standpoint, just saying what these things do. Because I'll hear people say, like, oh, I got a will. And it's like, all right, well, do you have these other things? Right. And they're like, no, I just did a will online. And I'm like, you know, but anyway, so yeah, to your point, there's lots of different trusts that work different ways. So not to get too deep into the weeds about that sort of stuff. There's revocable and irrevocable. Most trusts that we see today are going to be some sort of revocable trust. Irrevocable is really used for, like, when I say estate planning, I mean like people with large estates with estate tax issues, and they need to get things out of their estate for estate tax purposes. And anyways, not to get too deep into that, because it's not going to apply to a lot of people. And I think when people hear, when they talk about trusts or hear about trusts, they're like, well, you know, I think trusts are for rich folks. And it's like, well, you know, yes, the wealthy people do utilize different types of trusts for different reasons. But I think if most people understood what a trust is and how it works, I think more people would utilize trusts than who currently do. I'm not saying everybody needs a trust. But like we were talking about earlier, as far as like, hey, we all hope to leave our kids in a better situation. But sometimes, especially when the children are minors or children, the fear is, well, I don't want to spoil them, and I don't want them to be irresponsible with the money. Valid concerns, right? Because if they're 5 and 8 or something like that, then we don't really know. We hope they grow up to be great people, but we don't know, right?
Sure.
And it's all this needs to be done under the assumption that you're dying tomorrow, right? So if you leave money outright to the child, so again, let's assume that we made the children beneficiary on these things, and we named a custodian, this and the other. Most of the time with these custodial accounts, the child will be able to have control and access to this account when they reach age of majority, which in most states is 18. So that, I don't know about you, but when I was 18, would not have done me any good to have a bunch of money dumped in my lap. And I think most people listening would probably feel the same way. So with a trust, you can do several things. One, and so the third thing about that, like, they don't want to spoil them, they don't want them to be irresponsible with the money. And the third thing that the average person doesn't think about, but professionals might think about, is the protection of that money, right? Because if you left that money, let's fast forward, and let's assume they're adults, and they're grown and they're wise and responsible and all those things. So we have no fear of those other things. And we left them X amount of dollars. Well, now that money is legally theirs and is exposed to their risks of bankruptcies, lawsuits, and divorces, which divorce in and of itself, I think today is 56% risk, right? So nobody's leaving money to their child to make their child's ex-spouse rich, right?
Right.
So if you
sure.
leave it in a trust, the trust owns it, not them. It is for them, but they don't own it. So it should be protected from bankruptcies, lawsuits, and divorces and things like that. So that's protection of the money paramount. So that's what that's for. Also, in the trust, depending on how you have it set up, you can completely dictate when and how and under what circumstances they have access to the money. So what I mean is, it could be things like it will pay for education, but not living expenses while receiving your education, because I have an attorney friend who has a client who's in his 70s, who's been in college for the last 50 something years, because somebody left him money in a trust that would pay for his education and living expenses while receiving his education. So he found that loophole and has been living off the trust ever since, as long as he is still in college. I'm sure that was not the intent of the person who left him that money in the trust.
Likely not.
But regardless, that's the way it is. So again, education expenses, but not living expenses while receiving your education. Maybe it's like a certain percentage down payment on your first home, 20, 30%, but you got to be able to afford the other 70, 80%, right? So that's a nice leg up that not a lot of people have, but we're not paying for your home, right?
Yep.
Maybe it's a certain dollar amount if you want to start a business, or a certain percentage if you want to start a business. But the caveat being, you have to present a business plan to the trustee, who's basically in charge of the trust, and they have to approve it. So in other words, you're not getting $100,000 to start a popsicle business, selling popsicles out of a cooler on the beach or something, right? So, which you could still argue is a business, but that was not the intent. I've seen trusts where the beneficiaries have to pass a drug test before accessing money from the trust every time they want to access money from the trust. I've seen all sorts of things. So again, you can really get creative with when and how and under what circumstances they have access to the money in the trust. But again, if done correctly, it will bypass probate. It will go, you might set these guardrails and things like that to where, again, you can have a little bit of control over what money they get, when, and under what circumstances. Now, that is presumably with long-term trust planning. Most trusts that I've ever seen written, most of them where basically it says the beneficiaries of the trust will get their part of the trust at this age. 25 is the most common age that I've seen. I've seen 30, 35, I've even seen 55, but 25 seems to be the most common age that I see. So in other words, like if you left them X amount of dollars or whatever assets at 25, they just get them and they're theirs now, and the trust no longer owns it, which could be okay. But then we get back to that. Well, and even if it's 55 or whatever, we still get back to that same problem of, well, now it's their assets and are splittable on a divorce and exposed to bankruptcies and lawsuits and all those things. So are we really accomplishing what we want to accomplish, depending on what you want to accomplish? And so most attorneys, for whatever reason, are not super keen on doing the long-term trust planning. I've never had an attorney tell me this, but my gut feeling tells me it's because it's fairly complicated and they're not maybe super comfortable doing it. I hear a lot of attorneys say, well, that's very complicated. They don't need all that and this, that, the other. And I'm like, well, first of all, it's not for you to decide. It's for them to decide. Second of all, don't get paid by the hour, right? So like if this is complicated and takes you more time, isn't this in your best interest to do this, right? But again, my feeling is a lot of these estate planning documents are templated. So they just have templates for these and they're just plugging in names and important information. And so I don't feel like they do a lot of long-term trusts and might not be super comfortable doing them, so they avoid them. But that might be the perfect thing for you to do. So if you get any pushback from an attorney about that, make sure that you push back on it as well and get done what you think is best. But any questions about trust before I move on to like the basic estate planning documents?
Well, let's talk about just in the trust, and maybe we're getting there, but you'd mentioned earlier titling things in the name of the trust, making sure insurance policies are payable to the trust, that sort of thing. It might be good to talk about in broad terms how trust could be used, but also specifically like what should you look for? Like in your example, this guy had a trust and he probably thought he was covered, but things weren't titled, things weren't payable on death to the trust. And and this is probably getting into territory where you absolutely need to consult someone for your exact situation. But can we talk about maybe just again with broad strokes on what that might look like?
I'm glad you brought that up. I should have. Yeah. So the trust is only good if it owns. It's only going to accomplish what you want it to accomplish if it owns things. So that either means titling things to the trust or having the trust be beneficiary of things to make sure that the trust owns those things. Otherwise, if it owns nothing, then we paid a lot of money to have this thing created, and it's not going to do anything. So yeah, that's the problem with the follow up a lot of times. And again, I don't mean to disparage any of my attorney friends, because it's not everybody, but more often it happens more often than it should, where the attorney's getting paid to write up the documentation, and they might send you home. Maybe there's a verbal explanation of, hey, here's what you want to make sure to do. You might have slipped into your folder, like, here's the follow up things, make sure to do this, that, or the other. But there's not the attorney's basically done, right? So there's not a lot of follow through or follow up. It's up to the person to make sure that they are titling things over to the trust and know what to title over to the trust and how to get it done and make sure it's done correctly, and then changing beneficiaries and all the stuff. And so most people, again, avoid what they don't understand. So they're going to look at that document and say, all right, I think I know what this says, but I'm not exactly sure. So I'm going to either do nothing or tentatively do this and hope I'm not screwing it up. Right. So Again, a lot of times we, or firms like us, will make sure to kind of walk through that to make sure, like, all right, and we'll have a conversation with the attorney to make sure, all right, what assets need to be titled to the trust and what are we going to make the trust beneficiary on and all the stuff. And then we'll make sure that, we're giving you those friendly nudges and helping you as we can to make sure those things take place. But yeah, the trust is only good if the trust owns things. And I will say that example that I gave you earlier, that business owner that had the dozen properties already owned in the trust that were all paid off, we kind of brought up to him like, hey, man, you have millions of dollars worth of real estate. And then, potentially the business as well owned by this trust. That's a lot of liability concentrated in one area, because how this works, so all dozen of those properties are rented out. They're rental properties and they have tenants in them. So if somebody gets hurt on one of those properties, they can sue the owner of the property and have access to, and potentially, be able to take basically the assets from the owner of the property, which is the trust that owns all the other properties. And at some point, maybe the business, again, not at that point, but at some point. So we got a lot of concentrated risk there, man, like all those things are up for grabs. So we, had a conversation like, look, one of two things need to happen. So I don't want people to assume like, well, I'm going to put all my money in the trust and it's protected and put all my assets and put all my stuff. That's like, well, there is a shield between your personal assets and the assets that the trust owns, but all the assets that the trust owns are still kind of, open to liability within the trust. And so I was like, look, man, one of two things need to happen. We either need to get a sizable umbrella policy, which is basically personal or, liability insurance, if you will, that covers, that the trust owns, that covers all of the, properties in the trust. So maybe a couple $1 million worth, $2-3 million worth, which isn't very expensive, maybe a couple thousand a year, not very expensive. Or, and we didn't suggest this, I was like, or you can split those things out into separate business entities, LLCs, and have the trust own the LLCs. So that way they're separated out. They're separate. We have this separation of liability, but still the trust owns the LLCs, ergo kind of owns, the properties. But that way we're not mixing these liabilities. So that is a way to do that too, right? If you had a trust, you could have assets owned by business entities such as LLCs and have the trust own the LLCs. So that way we have an extra layer of liability protection.
Well, and I think that's a good point that the trust can own LLCs. So one of the conversations that's going on, that has been going on, I guess, is that when your business gets to a certain size, and again, please consult your attorney, maybe shouldn't also own the land it sits on, right? Maybe we should have those in separate buckets. And there's also tax advantages to separating them, that sort of thing. But to have separate business organizations, whether it's corporations or LLCs or whatever it is, have different organizations own them, but the trust can then sit above that, owning both of those entities, it sounds like.
That's right. Now, a couple wrinkles to that. So, yes, and that is something that we talk to clients about. And you can separate out, almost always it makes sense to separate out the commercial real estate that you might be running your business out of for multiple reasons. One is most businesses nowadays in today's tax environment are probably filing as an S corporation. And most of the time, it doesn't make sense for real estate to be owned by an S corporation. And so, to your point, by separating it out, that's an extra layer of liability protection. And again, probably more tax advantageous. But you can also separate out vehicles and equipment. So it could be vehicles and then equipment, or vehicles and equipment in one business entity. You could also potentially separate out employees and have an employee leasing company own those employees, and that the business entity is paying a employee lease payment to the employee. Anyway, so there's all sorts of little wrinkles that you can do in that.
Sure.
I will say it is very hard, and maybe not the best thing to do to have a trust own an S corporation. So, like the business entity, if it is filing as an S corporation, it is going to be very hard and or not advisable to try to have the trust own the S corporation. So it's generally much easier if they're LLCs not filing as an S corporation or things like that. So not getting too deep into the weeds, but
Sure.
So like the client that we talked about earlier, where the trust didn't own the business. It was for good reason. And so we ended up, talking to him and his attorney about creating this other trust that will own the business. But the way we're going to do that, again, since he's going to sell it at some point, it's got to be done the year that he's looking at selling, and got to be done before he gets an LOI, before, you know what I mean? So it's got to be, because you're basically going to give up the S election in that year, and it needs to be done in such a way that it doesn't look like we're, trying to get too creative. Anyways, it had to be done in a certain way, but there's all these little, again, back to what you said earlier, make sure to consult your team to make sure that you're doing these things the way you need to do it.
That's it. Is all of this should revert back to, guys, this is really, for educational purposes only, right? This isn't guidance. This isn't instruction. This is, hey, here's some things to spark a conversation to have with your team of professionals, or maybe spark the interest in you to start forming the team of advisors that then can look at your specific situation and say, okay, for this situation with these assets and liabilities, this would probably make the most sense for the group.
Yeah, and I'm happy to, and we've talked about this before, and I don't want this to seem like any sort of commercial for us or anything, but I mean, we've been very embraced by the fence industry, and as a way to do our best to try to give back. I mean, we want to provide as much educational things as possible, but for anybody who's listening, that is like, I just need somebody to kind of talk to for a few minutes to make sure to at least point me in the right direction. And it may not be us. I'm happy to refer you to attorneys or to refer to whoever, or just answer your questions, right? So if somebody wants to schedule like a quick call with us to, ask some questions about their specific situation and just kind of get some friendly advice or get pointed in the right direction, I'm happy to do that. We won't charge for it. I'm not going to try to make you a client or anything. I just want to try to be helpful. So if we can do that, I'm happy to. So you can just reach out to the office or something like that, and we'll schedule a 30-minute call or whatever. And I'm happy to answer any questions, point in the right direction, refer you to who you need to be referred to, all that. So again, back to the master file. If you want a copy of the master file template, happy to send that to you. But again, we want to make sure that you have the things taken care of that you need to have taken care of.
I love that. Well, I tell you what, this seems like a pretty good place to land the plane for now. It seems like every time we wrap up one of these conversations, we end with, there's so much more here to talk about. We've got 2 or 3 more episodes to where, I think this is our 4th or 5th conversation. It feels like we've had a lot of these conversations that each individually stand up on their own, but when we start combining them together, hopefully leads to, if nothing else, just a better informed business owner or better informed contractor of things that they should know about to again start forming their team of advisors to circle up around them?
100%, man. Yeah, there's just, and especially with estate planning, like we talked about earlier, like there's so many common misconceptions. There's so many things that people don't know that work this way or to know to think of. Like we don't know what we don't know.
Sure.
And it creates a lot, not knowing these things or not having these things done creates a lot of problems, and they're easily avoidable. We just got to know to handle these things and then get them handled. Like it's not that hard. It's fairly simple. So just here's your sign to go to call somebody and get those things done.
Absolutely. Andrew, so you're very gracious to open yourself up for questions, that sort of thing. How would someone get a hold of your company, of you and your team?
Yeah, our website is atlasfinancialstrategies.com. Our phone number is 850-542-4803. And of course, that's on the website and everything as well. So feel free to reach out to us. And again, I'm happy to answer any questions or help in whatever way I can.
I love it. Andrew, thank you so much for being so giving of your time. Like I said, this is the fourth or fifth conversation, and it feels like we've got several more to go. I appreciate you being so willing to come on and continue to have these conversations.
Well, man, I can't tell you enough how much I appreciate you having me on, and I hope that the people listening are learning what we hope they're learning.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, guys, if you've got questions or comments, one, Andrew's a great resource for you. Two, drop them in the comments below. We're always happy to help however we can. I love engaging with you guys in the comments section. For now, Joe Everest, the fence expert, reminding you that good fences make good neighbors,